afternoon, all of you. Good afternoon, all the participants. So, this is day 3, and we are to session number 2 that will be delivered by Dr. Nagendra Singh. He'll be talking on protein structure and applications in drug discovery. So, let me just introduce you to Sir. Sir is working as assistant professor at School of Biotechnology, Gautam Buddha University in Greater Noida. He has a research experience of around 20 years and a teaching experience of around 10 years. He has a big list of research publications, almost 68 plus, and his number of citations are around 1300. He has around 225 protein bank data bank entries, and he was involved in various national conferences, invited lectures, international conferences, various PhD and MTech thesis supervisions, and various research projects. So, Sir has done his BSc and MSc and completed his PhD in structural biology, that was from AIMS. And his research interest includes elucidating roles of human splicing factors in cancers, structure function studies on enzyme involved in RNA metabolism from microbial origin, structure-based drug development of novel antimicrobial agents. And his specialization is molecular structural biology, X-ray crystallography, and drug design. So there is a big list of awards, fellowships, recognitions, and then research projects, publications, which Sir had taken up. So now I would like to request Sir to please start the session. And we are really thankful to you that you have accepted our invitation. It will be great to listen to you once again. I have just listened to you previously also in previous FDP. So I really look forward for more sessions from your side. Thank you, sir, for accepting. And over to you, sir. You can start your session.
Thank you so much. So nice of you, Dr. Roma. And at the onset, I'm really thankful to the organizers of this FDP for giving me the opportunity to interact with you all. And I think I can share my slides here. Is it visible to everyone, I hope?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Does it change also? Do the slide change?
Yes,
I'm
yes,
changing. Okay, that's fine.
Changes.
Sometimes it doesn't happen actually. Okay, great to be here. And the title of my presentation would be Protein Structure and Applications. Okay. So protein structures are, as you must be all aware, they are very beautiful molecules, in fact, ornamental molecules, and that's why many journals, they accept them on their cover pages. There are a few examples here. So the first question is, why do you determine a structure of a protein? So when you say structure, it simply means 3D structure of a protein. And that also means shape of the protein. So why do you need to determine shape of the protein? Is basically because any object, if you understand its shape, you can correlate that well with its function, right? So the same thing goes well with the proteins also. If you have a structure available for protein, 3D structure available, you can understand the catalysis. Catalysis means how substrate bind to that protein, how does it get catalyzed into product, or what are the residues responsible for binding to the substrate or any ligand or any receptor, and they are responsible for function of that protein. So all these information, all these understanding, you are aware when you have a structure of a protein available. In fact, in today's time, people working in different directions in biological sciences, they tend to get associated with a structure biology lab so that they can solve the structure of their protein as well. Because when you have a structure available, that really greatly aids to the information you gain in biological research. So that's why most of the people, they collaborate with the structural biologists and they take assistance in solving their protein structures, who are not actually structural biologists themselves. So then rational design of protein, if you have protein structure available, you can do protein engineering. The one branch of protein engineering is where structure of a protein is available. You can rationally modify amino acids by using site-directed mutagenesis, and you can change its function altogether, or you can improve its binding to ligand. And it's also a recent field in protein science where people tend to make mutations in order to gain different function, extract different function of a protein, and very commonly used in increasing thermal stability of the proteins. For example, you have a protein which is stable at say 40 degree, but you want to use that at say 60, 70 degree. You cannot use the same protein, native protein at higher temperature. So in order to make it more thermal resistant, one can make mutations. So there are two ways to do so. You can do randomly by evolutionary approach, or if a protein structure is available, you don't have to be random. You rationally, you can find out amino acids, you can target them to mutate, and after mutation, you can check their stability so that you can find a more stable molecule. That's a part of rational design in protein engineering. Then it also helps in understanding of protein folding. When protein structure is available, you have some idea about how protein must be folding. In fact, I'll show you one example in today's presentation. And of course, you must be well aware by today's date that the structure-based drug design is a most used application of proteins in today's time, where you can use a structure of a protein which is crucial for functioning of a microbe, for example, and then you can block its active site. And you can do so easily when protein structure is available. So these are the few major applications why you solve protein structures. And in this lecture, I'll try to briefly apprise you about how do you solve protein structure using X-ray crystallography. That's a main method so far available to determine shape of biomolecules. And there are three cases I'll try to cover in the given time. Like in case one, protein folding, I'll take one example of a protein structure which was used to find out how the protein must be folding. Then another example is for drug repurposing. Drug repurposing is a method, is a way to use old drugs for different indications. That's good to save times, in fact, because we know drug development is a very lengthy process. Then drug design, if structure is available, you can design molecules to inhibit substrate binding, you can inhibit function. So I'll try to talk about one example of that. Also here, we have tried to develop a molecule against cancer using in silico methods and further validated using in vitro studies. Now we know that there are four major ways you can determine protein structure. One is the X-ray crystallography. Most of the protein structures have been determined using X-ray diffraction techniques. The limitation here is you need to have crystal of a protein in order to solve its 3D structure. So that's a bottleneck also, because we know that everything is, if you are a structural biologist, you will understand everything, all the protein, they are crystallizable, but in what condition, that we need to explore. So that's why it's a bottleneck, because we don't know conditions for crystallization of all the proteins available. So you need to have a crystal in order to determine structure. And another technique is NMR. NMR is good. It does not require crystal to solve structure. In solution can be done, but the limitation for NMR is the size. If you have bigger size, you require very bigger magnet, very strong magnet, and moreover, if size of protein is very high, it's difficult to interpret the data. The spectra cannot be interpreted easily. So the size limitation is there. For small molecules, small proteins, NMR is very good. Then a new technique is coming up in today's time. That's a cryo-electron microscopy, where you don't need to crystallize protein. You can use electron microscopy, cryo-electron microscopy, and solve the structure. But there also, in fact, in recent time, new algorithms are being developed where high resolution structures are being obtained from protein molecules. So the size is again a hindrance here. If size is too small, then cryo-electron also require a lot of extra efforts. Then if nothing is available, you have in silico methods. Computers are there with you. They are programs which can predict 3D structure of a protein from a model, or ab initio prediction is also possible. But as we know, computer techniques, they are, I mean, you cannot rely them until you validate. So validation is required if you have done anything in silico. That's a disadvantage of all the computational methods, in fact. So in X-ray crystallography, the prerequisite is you need to have a pure protein sample. Your protein should be completely pure. It should be a homogeneous solution so that it is crystallized. And once it is crystallized, you bombard those crystals with the X-rays. You use X-rays here because X-rays has a wavelength which is in order of bond length in biomolecules. So when X-ray is bombarded, the X-rays are diffracted from electronic clouds from the crystals. And so the electron density is calculated from those properties of diffracted X-rays. And you use here a mathematical operator called Fourier transformation in order to gain information about electron density from a crystal from the diffraction pattern. And because we know that electron density is unique, every atom has unique number of electrons, so they have a unique electron density. So once electron density is available, you can fit atoms into those electron density on that data, finally refine it, and eventually you have 3D coordinates which you submit to Protein Data Bank. From there, it's freely available, accessible to everyone. Then this some pictures of crystals. Crystals are also very beautiful, and when you see them in contrasting background, they give different colors. These are some examples of protein crystals. They are like, in fact, they are called more precious than diamond. So once you have crystal, you bombard them with X-rays, and the diffraction pattern is calculated in form of these spots. And because X-rays are interact here with the electronic cloud in the crystal, so from these diffraction pattern, the properties of these diffracted rays is correlated with the electron density using Fourier transformation. And in this electron density, when you keep putting atoms, different amino acids in the protein, and eventually you have a model available. The 3D structure or shape of a protein is available to you. So the electron density initially, it looks like this. You see here this blue color mesh. And if you see more clearly, it's going on, in fact, continuous. This is a backbone of proteins, which is going on. So you have to trace. In X-ray crystallography, you need to trace the backbone from first amino acid to the last one, and you keep fitting amino acids in the electron density, because every amino acid have a definite number of atoms. Their shape is different, electron density is different. So just by looking at the shape of electron density, you can really see which amino acid would be fitting here. So that's so precise. And that's why even it's called one of the most accurate sciences also, because chances of biasness is less in comparison to other techniques. So this is an example, how do you get electron density? If you see here, these are the main chain atom going on like this. And just by looking at the shape of the electron density, you can say this is a penta atom ring. So it must be proline here. Similarly, you have this side chain. If you know the structure of amino acids, you can understand this must be isoleucine and so on. So as a crystallographer, you need to fit all the amino acids here, and you keep going on. That's called model building, and it becomes something like this. So for example, this is proline. You cannot put anything except proline here because electron density is specific to, you look at the shape of this greenish mesh is resembling the shape of this proline. Similarly here, histidine, isoleucine. So chances of biasness is very less here. In fact, if you put wrong amino acid here, that also give you a problem in your structure determination. There are in fact many mathematical numbers what you deal with when you solve structure using X-ray diffraction. So those numbers basically give you an idea whether you are doing right thing or not. If you are putting wrong amino acid, for example, here instead of isoleucine, you are putting some other amino acid, you are confused. So in that case, those parameters, validation parameters would change. And you will have idea that this is incorrect what you have put. So you have to keep only right atoms at the right, like in a right electron density. If you misinterpret it, you will have wrong values, and that's how it's very accurate science, in fact, because chances of biasness is very little here. Similarly, you look at this is a side chain. If you know structure of amino acid, this is tyrosine side chain. You look at the greenish mesh, it's exactly following the atom side chain of this tyrosine amino acid. So you have oxygen atom here, you have more density because oxygen has more electrons in comparison to carbon atom. Hydrogen, they are not shown because they are too little to diffract X-rays here in this structure. So that's how it is one of the very accurate sciences, and many people tend to get associated in order to solve protein structure of their own interest with some structure biology lab. And you see everything when you solve structure of a protein, you see everything means everything bound to protein. For example, water molecules. So these are water molecules. We know that a protein, when it's present in solution, is hydrated. It has solvation layer around it. Water molecules are interacting on the surface of the protein. That's how it's soluble in water. Similarly, any ligand bound, you will see electron density of those ligands. For example, here, there are some ligands, looks like some nucleotide. So you will see everything what is there in solution with the protein. Any drug bound, ligand bound, water, ion, whatever is there with the protein, that will be seen when you determine shape of the protein or 3D structure of the protein. So this is ATP. So adenosine triphosphate. So it's matching very well. So electron density is the one which guides you when you do model building, when you finally refine coordinates in your data which you have achieved from X-ray diffraction. So first example I'll talk here is about protein folding. So that is about crystal structure of an expanded molten globule intermediate. So here we were solving crystal structure of a protein, and we had no idea how the protein structure looks like. So in two conditions, same protein was crystallized, and eventually when we compared both the data set, we could see that one structure is not native. It looked like a molten globule intermediate. When protein folds, we know that they are intermediate forms also. So those are known as molten globule. So that was found to be a molten globule intermediate of the protein folding. So before that, we all know this folding funnel. So when in cytosol, proteins are being synthesized during translation, so they do not have any structure, but when they fall into aqueous environment, because proteins are amphipathic in nature, we know that, all the globular protein basically. So when a protein fall into cytosol, which is aqueous in nature, it doesn't remain as such. It start folding. And that is to hide non-polar stretches from water, because we know that there's a process called hydrophobic effect where non-polar substances, they aggregate in water. So the same thing happens with the proteins. So initially, proteins are there in the random coil after translation. Then they start acquiring secondary structures, and eventually the secondary structure, it collapses into a most stable, thermodynamically most stable structure that's called native state. In fact, it has been also observed that native state of proteins, they are metastable in nature. They are not the one which is thermodynamically is having lowest energy. No. In fact, using computational methods, you can have protein structure even much lesser energy than the protein which is actually there in solution. So those structures in cell, in cytosol, those are metastable. They have we cannot say lowest, but they have low delta G, low energy. And in between these intermediates, which are basically expanded form, means which are having bigger size, and they are not, and when they collapse together, they squeezed out water molecules and become compact native structure. So that's what is understood so far. And this is from textbook. You must be aware that the basic factor behind protein folding is hydrophobic effect. So hydrophobic effect means when you have any non-polar substance and you try to dissolve that into water, that non-polar substance does not interact with water because of contrasting properties of water and the substance. So what happens? Non-polar substance create thermodynamically unfavorable structural changes into the water. In fact, cavities on the surface of waters are formed, and in those cavities, water molecules they surround non-polar portion of the compound. So something like here, it is some fatty acid example. So when you try to dissolve the fatty acid, the non-polar chain does not like with the water, but same time it restrict freedom of water molecules around it. So these water molecules, they have lowest freedom, and this is called entropy in thermodynamics. And entropy is something for a spontaneous process, you need to increase it. It's a freedom. It's basically nature of the whole universe from molecular level to the gross level. So entropy of everything should be increased. So that's why. So entropy here is decreased because of these non-polar substances. So these water, they don't like to remain stable. So the water become more unstable thermodynamically. So eventually what happens after some time, when sufficient non-polar molecules have been dissolved in water, these water molecule pushes non-polar substances together. So they associate together. So in that process, what happens? Some water molecule which were trapped, they are become liberated. So delta as the entropy is increased here. And the entropy further increased when there is a formation of micelle structure where polar groups are on the surface which can interact with water, and inside everything is non-polar. So this hydrophobic effect is one way to hide interactions between non-polar groups and the polar water. The same thing happens in case of proteins also, because in proteins, globular proteins, you have hydrophobic patches also. So those hydrophobic patches, they don't like to interact with water in cytosol after translation is completed. So what happens? Those hydrophobic patches, they come together, non-polar groups, non-polar amino acids, they come together and they acquire a structure where non-polar amino acid stretches, patches, they are hidden inside. So only the polar groups are on the surface of the protein, and that's what we call protein folding. So basically it's a water molecule which governs hydrophobic effect, and also it governs the folding of protein. If you have a protein and you try to put into non-polar solvent, it would never fold. So water is the factor which is responsible for folding of proteins. And there are many theories given about protein folding. There are two prominent. One is called framework model, where you have a primary sequence of proteins, and this primary sequence, it acquire a shape, and after acquiring shape, secondary structural elements are formed. In another theory, protein first, due to hydrophobic effect, the primary structure acquire a shape, and then first secondary structures are formed, then it acquire a shape, and eventually it converted into a most stable native structure. So in this example, we have used an enzyme called peptidyl tRNA hydrolase from Mycobacterium smegmatis. And this enzyme was crystallized into two different conditions. We collected X-ray diffraction data. But before that, this enzyme is responsible basically removing tRNA from amino acid. We know that when translation occurs, tRNA carries amino acid to ribosome. And many times when translation is going on because of incorporation of incorrect codon, incorrect amino acid, translation abortion occurs. So in cytosol, and the last amino acid of that nascent polypeptide, which is just formed, remains attached to tRNA. So this is tRNA here. So last amino acid of the peptide which is formed remain attached to tRNA, and this PTH, peptidyl tRNA hydrolase, basically hydrolyze this bond between tRNA and the amino acid, the peptide, so that this tRNA is freely available and it can be used for translation process in the next cycle. So this is very important, very crucial enzyme which replenish tRNA in the cell after translation is completed or abortion of translation is occurring in the cell due to many physiological reasons. So we crystallize this PTH, peptidyl tRNA hydrolase from Mycobacterium. 2 crystals were obtained in 2 different conditions. We collected their X-ray diffraction data. And even the diffraction, there are some numbers. If you are not crystallographer, it's very difficult to comprehend for you. But just to give you a brief idea, these numbers were different in both the cases. MSPTH1 we call the native enzyme, and another enzyme which crystallized in different condition was PTH2 that was expanded, and we call that molten globule state. So if you look at the different parameters after structure were determined for both the cases, the average pitch value of alpha helix in native state it was 5.1 angstrom. This is average pitch value of alpha helical conformation. Secondary structure in protein. In MSPTH2 it was increased. Similarly, beta sheet 7.1, it is increased to 7.6. Average hydrogen bond distances. We know the secondary structures, they are stabilized by hydrogen bonded interactions. So in alpha helix, in native, it was 3 angstrom. It is increased to 3.9. The distance alpha the hydrogen bonding distance increase in the secondary structure. Similarly, in beta sheet is also increased. And there are many, in fact, if you look at the secondary structural content, native structure, 36.6% alpha helix. It was reduced to 30.9 in the second data. Similarly, beta sheet was 22, reduced to 19.9 in the molten globule state. And if you look at the energy, the native state is more stable, minus 5776 kilojoule per mole energy was there, whereas in the molten globule, it was lesser stable. Then many of the side chain in molten globule, they were lacking hydrogen bonded partners as well. And even size was also increased. If you compare the size of both the structure, we could find that 1.4 times, almost 25% size was increased in the case of molten globule state. And that's why that's one of the reasons we're calling it intermediate protein folding. So dimensions, the protein dimensions were increased, 37 to 32 width, and here 38 to 33. So all the dimensions, it was like the protein has taken up water and is swollen, it's become swollen, it increased in size. And that's what happens in molten globules are swollen molecules which have water, and when they squeeze out water from them, they acquire native shape of the enzyme protein. Even water molecules, we could see that in the molten globule state, there are more number of water, 170 water molecules we could trace, whereas in case of native structure, there were lesser water molecules. So that indicate that waters, they are more in case of molten globule has absorbed water. So in order to get converted into native state, so those water molecules should be squeezed out. Hydrodynamic radii also increased around 1 nanometer in case of molten globule state. And another observation was binding to ligands. In case of native structure, this is active site where substrate binds. So the opening of active site was 4.5 angstrom in native structure, whereas it's increased more, 6.6 in case of the molten globule state. And another point in case of molten globule, because active site has become wider, so solvent molecules, in fact, they are beta-ME and polyethylene glycol molecules, they entered into the active site due to because it's expanded. There's more size, more space available in the molten globule state. Then if you look at these interaction, this is one example of a beta sheet. In case of beta sheet in native structure, we see that all the distances, they are optimum. What should be for ideal hydrogen bonded interactions. But if you compare the same distances in molten globule, you will see, say, 2.6 angstrom increase to 3.5. And all these distances, they have been increased. It's like in case of molten globule, the beta sheets, they are stretched from the ends. It's pulled from both the ends. So it becomes more expanded. Then even alpha is an example of alpha helix. So one of the alpha helix we see here, We know that in alpha helix you have one I plus 4th hydrogen bonding. So NH and CO hydrogen bonding here. So 3 angstrom distance in case of native structure, it increased to over 4 angstrom in molten globules pulled. So here helix also, all the helices, they are pulled apart. So like you pull the spring, make it more wider. Then we could see that even van der Waals interaction in the core. Globular proteins, they have non-polar core inside, and you have non-polar amino acid side chain packed in the core. So in the core also we could see that this is native structure. The distances were dramatically increased in case of molten globule. So core also has been disrupted in case of intermediate state. So similarly, interhelical separation. So helices, they interact here. They are together in native state, but they have been pulled apart in the molten globule, 16.4. So 14 angstrom distance is increased to 16.4, and all the distances, they have been increased drastically in case of molten globule. That again indicate this is expanded form. It is kind of swollen intermediate of protein folding. So in one active site, 3 amino acids in the active site, there are 2 histidines, 1 aspartic acid, which involve in catalysis by this enzyme. And these are hydrogen bonded to each other. Whereas in case of molten globule, the distances are increased. So this is no longer any hydrogen bond actually. So it cannot even perform catalysis because of it's become more distant. Then we also could see that water molecule, they are disturbing secondary structural elements. And this is one example where one water molecule is basically penetrating a beta sheet. It's penetrating beta sheet, and that's how those beta strands, they are going away from each other. And that's how protein must be unfolding in this fashion. And we could compare that swelling, this difference, the deviation was less in case of regions which are present in the core of the protein. So these are 5 regions which present in the core of the hydrophobic core of the protein. So deviation was less in those cases. So that suggests that in the core, you have least deviation. On the surface, you have maximum. So swelling is occurring in concentric rings in this protein while it's being unfolded. So somehow this was one example we could trap where a protein is absorbing water due to some environmental changes and is trying to be unfolding. So this intermediate was trapped in the crystal structure. In fact, it was first example where any protein intermediate structure is available using X-ray diffraction technique. So now the second example is drug repurposing for COVID-19. This is another application of protein structures. You can do drug repurposing. So before that, in structure-based drug design, you need to have the primary requirement is structure determination of the target enzyme. So you need to find out a target enzyme for designing a drug. Target enzyme should be a protein which is essential for survival of the cell. For example, if you are talking about coronavirus, so you need to select an enzyme of coronavirus which is required for life cycle of this virus, or any bacteria or anything you want to choose that should be critical for the cell to sustain its life. So when you select the target, you solve its 3D structure. If it is not already available, you understand how the catalysis is occurring, where substrate is binding, where ligand is binding, which are amino acids, that's crucial for interaction with the substrate and catalysis. Mode of orientation of substrate, how substrate is binding, that also should be known to you when you design a compound inhibitor against an enzyme. And in fact, you need to do complete mapping of that enzyme to get maximum information, how different type of ligands binds, which are preferred most. And then accordingly, rationally, you can think of a compound which would be inhibiting strongly to that enzyme. And then identification of the critical residues for interaction is understood by making complexes. So how do you know which are the sites, which are the amino acids critical for binding to substrate or any ligand? So in that case, you need to solve 3D structure of that target with known or unknown molecules. So they bind to the active site and you can see them how they are binding. So once you understand that binding mechanism, it would be very easy for you to think of molecules which can replace the substrate and become inhibitor to that enzyme. So in structure-based drug design, so you do first as you must be aware, target identification, you identify a target, validate, it should be critical for the function, then you produce that target in cell, cloning expression, molecular biology is a most common method to produce protein molecules in lab. Then you crystallize it. After crystallization, you solve its 3D structure. You find out some compounds which bind to it. There are many ways to find. In fact, today it's become very easy. You have computational tools available and millions of compounds are there in different databases. So you can simply just search those databases and find out which are the compounds which have best complementarity with your enzymes. And once you have a compound, you call that lead compound, which is binding well and is assumed to be having very good effects. So these lead compound can be tested or it can be used, in fact, to improve binding to the target enzyme. So it go for biological testing, then preclinical development, and from there goes for clinical development in order to see the efficacy and safety of the compound to be used for the given indication. So it's a very simple diagram to show you. For example, you have got a compound here. This is active site, and this compound is binding. So in just by looking at this structure, you can think where is the scope available to increase the size of the compound. So it occupies, the idea here is compound should occupy maximum space in the active site. So in order to have a compound occupying, for example, here maximum space, you require to add one group this side. Similarly, you can add one group here also. So this area is occupied where initially water molecule was bound. And this area also can be occupied well. So by rationally, logically thinking, you can design a molecule which occupy maximum area in the active site. That's what you do in drug design. And in fact, today, because of presence of so many databases, become really very easy. You don't have to rationally think much. You just screen databases available. They are free of cost, available online. You can screen them, and out of those millions of compound, whichever occupy maximum area obviously would be having maximum affinity. So those compounds you can select and you can go for their testing and preclinical development. And in fact, one more thing is done here because they are single bonds in these compounds. So when you have single bonds, is they are free to rotate. It means there are n number of conformation may exist of the same compound. So it means that the same compound can bind more than one target. So its specificity would be compromised. So in order to increase specificity or selectivity of the compound, you do rigidification. Rigidification means you fix the number of conformation. So how do you do that? You just introduce a double bond, for example, here. You can introduce a double bond. So when you introduce a double bond, the number of conformer this compound is going to have would be limited. It means the chances of this compound to bind to many targets would be restricted. So that's how you can increase specificity of a ligand of a drug molecule against a given target by just looking at the structure and the interaction, analyzing the interaction, how this compound is binding to the given target. Then obviously you also must be aware your compound should follow the rule of 5, that's also known as Lipinski rule. And basically it came from the idea because, for example, when we eat something, you have eaten glucose, say. So glucose, your cell knows during developmental stage, cell knew that glucose is required for the development. So when the development was completed, glucose receptors channels, those were available in the cell. So when you eat glucose, your intestine and stomach epithelial cell lining, that will absorb glucose because receptors are available, or any nutrient. So receptor for them, channels and pores, transportation mechanism is there. But when you eat a foreign compound, nature was not aware that humans will be eating aspirin one day. So there is no mechanism to absorb aspirin. There is no facilitation for aspirin absorption or any drug because they are foreign substance. They are not, I mean, body was not made to take them, but because of disease and development of medical sciences, there are drugs available and you need to take them. So how do you do it? So for that was the Lipinski rule derived, because we know that lipid bilayer in epithelial membrane, the lipid bilayer is non-polar in nature. So, and we know that the rule of like dissolves like. So anything which is polar, that cannot go across. The lipid bilayer cannot be absorbed because of different nature. So only non-polar substance can go across because they can dissolve in the lipid bilayer being the same chemical nature, and it can be transported from your intestine to the blood. From blood, it will go to different part of body and it will show its effect. So for example, when you eat aspirin, as for aspirin, there is no receptor. So it will be absorbed by simple diffusion across lipid bilayer. So Lipinski gave this rule so that a molecule is simply diffused across lipid bilayer when you eat it. So that's why all the drugs which are taken orally, they are non-polar in nature. Because being non-polar, it can be absorbed, and they have some other restriction as per Lipinski. So all these restriction like your non-polarity, log p-value, molecular weight should be small, smaller than 500, hydrogen bond donor less than 10, 5. So these 4 rules were made so that drug is orally available to you, and then it is absorbed easily to the body, inside the body to the blood. So Lipinski rule is basically followed by the drugs which are taken. If you have a drug, for example, you have insulin. Insulin is a drug. And in fact, it's a real problem in today's time. Many pharma companies, they are working so that it's become orally available instead of injecting inside blood. So, but it's not possible to take it because it's a polar molecule. It cannot get absorbed. You need to devise a mechanism for its absorption. Moreover, insulin, it will be degraded if you give as such. There are enzymes in stomach which will hydrolyze it. So such kind of molecule which are bigger in size, which don't follow Lipinski rule, they are generally injected directly into the blood. They are not given orally because absorption would not occur. So this Lipinski rule was basically to have the maximum absorption of drug into your stomach and intestine. So this should be followed. If you are doing drug designing, you need to remember that these 4 points should be followed by the compound so that the absorption is easy when you eat it. And of course, we know that once you drug discovery and development is a long process. It used to be a long process before COVID-19, but in COVID-19, there are many tragic things happened, but along with that, the positive thing happened is that the development has become very fast. The drug development, initially it used to be around 10, it used to take 10 years to develop a molecule. But COVID has taught us if all the agencies, all pharma companies, researchers, government system, they come together and cooperate, it can be done within less than 1 year. So to develop a molecule against a given indication. So the second example is identification of potential inhibitor of coronavirus endoribonuclease from FDA-approved drugs. That's a drug repurposing. So in drug repurposing, already if they are already known drugs for some other disease, their toxicity is known to the body. So at least in clinical trials, you don't worry about that it will be toxic to the humans, and how much is tolerable to human, that is also there if it's FDA-approved drug. So advantage using FDA-approved drug for repurposing is that you can save time. You don't have to worry about several parameters like toxicity. So you only need to see the efficacy. So that's the way you can save time in developing drug by using drug repurposing method. So in this, you have to take drugs which have been already approved, which are available in the market, if they can be used for other indications. So here we have taken an enzyme, endoribonuclease for coronavirus 2, and then FDA-approved drug database was used. High throughput virtual screening was done. In silico doping studies were performed. Molecular dynamic simulation was used to validate binding of the drug compounds. binding energies were calculated, and finally, some potent molecules were selected which could have a great potential to inhibit endoribonuclease of coronavirus 2 in solution as well. So then there were five drugs which we could find out from the FDA approved database, and one control compound, citrate, was used as a control compound in docking, and 3 programs were used for docking studies, and we could see that these 5 drugs, they were better than the control compound in using all the 3 different platforms of docking. Then their energies were calculated. Those also were found to be better than the control compound. So we thought that those are better. They are binding at the same place and would have the better affinity. Then validation were done for binding to all the drugs to the receptor endoribonuclease using 100 nanosecond MD simulation. And we could see that in case of RMST, RMSF, all the trajectories were stabilized. These all overall indicate there is no structural perturbation in the receptor after binding to these drugs. And even hydrogen bonds, those were remaining stable for during the entire 100 nanosecond MD simulation. Then even hydrogen bonded interaction, radius of gyration of the complexes were stable. There was no remarkable difference in the structure after binding to ligand. Even secondary structural elements after binding to all these ligands, those were unperturbed. There were no change in the structure. There were no secondary structural change after binding ligand to the receptor here. So these are kind of validation you get when you do molecular dynamic simulations. And you also could contribute that the amino acids which are responsible to contributing to the binding energy of the ligands. So that also can be found out. These are different positions of amino acids which are contributing to binding to the receptor. Then we could see that all these ligands, they bind to on the surface of the protein, where the substrate binds, where the active site. And they form all the compounds, they form extensive hydrogen bonded interactions along with van der Waals forces, which stabilize the complex formation. So on the surface, this is where AMP binds, the substrate binds, and the same site, all the drugs, all the 5 drugs which we could explore, they bind to the same site. Here you can see them. So all the drugs, they are binding to the active site. So we assume, giving indication that they may work as competitive inhibitor to this enzyme. So, but the problem, as you know, is that it needs to be validated using in vivo and in vitro lab experiments, because just from computer it's difficult to trust everything, because computer is made by human beings. So it cannot go thinking of beyond thinking of human beings. So in order to that, all the computational result you get, you require validation parameters from in vitro or in vitro or in vivo. So third example is designing anti-cancer drug. Here we have used one target that is a kinase, SRPK1, serine arginine protein kinase 1. So this work is recently been accepted into the journal Aging from New York. It's a reputed journal. So before that, alternative splicing. We know that in eukaryotic cell, alternative splicing goes on. That means a gene can produce different kind of products. And alternative splicing is also known to be hallmark of cancer. In cancer, many apoptotic genes, they are expressed in different variants. So that is already known. And the proteins which are responsible for this splicing, the help in splicing, they are called SR, a large family of protein called SR protein. SR means serine arginine rich proteins. So these proteins have a domain which is rich in dipeptide called serine and arginine amino acids. So this dipeptide is repeated many times in SR proteins, and these SR proteins basically help in splicing. We know that in splicing there are many factors of spliceosome which interact with the messenger RNA, and SR protein mediate interaction between RNA and the splicing factors. So that's how SR protein contribute to splicing of different genes. So here we have taken one SR protein which is involved in splicing of apoptotic genes. And that protein is called ASF-SF2, alternative splicing factor number 2. There are several factors known of this family, and we have taken this splicing factor, which is a 28 kilodalton protein. It has two domain which binds to RNA. They are RNA recognition motif, and one domain which is repeat in RS dipeptide. So in order to perform function, this protein gets phosphorylated at RS domain, and that is done by a kinase called SRPK1, serine arginine protein kinase 1. So SRPK1 phosphorylate as RS domain of this splicing factor, and then this splicing factor is transported from cytosol to nucleus to perform alternative splicing. And we also have seen that this SRSF is overexpressed in several cancer cell lines. So idea here was to block transportation of this splicing factor from cytosol to nucleus so that it interrupt alternative splicing of apoptotic genes. So this is ASF-SF2 factor, which is present in cytosol. SRPK1 phosphorylate this, add a phosphate group to RS dipeptide repeats, of course, by using with the help of ATP molecules. And then this phosphorylated ASF, this is capable of transporting inside nucleus. So if you inhibit phosphorylation of this protein, it won't be able to get transported to the nucleus. So the function may be abrupted. That's what the idea here. So if we design an inhibitor molecule which bind to SRPK1, so SRPK is not able to phosphorylate ASF-SF2, and hence it cannot get diffused, it cannot get transported to nucleus, because when it is inside nucleus, it is involved in alternative splicing of anti-apoptotic genes, and those genes they cause cancer eventually. That's what is known. So we looked for several inhibitors of SRPK1 using natural databases. We're starting with in silico studies. So the structure of SRPK1 is available in Protein Data Bank. In fact, SRPK complex with ASF-SF2 domain, a domain which bind to SRPK, that complex is also available. So we studied all these interactions between this SRPK1 and this RRM domain of ASF2. And in fact, there is a ternary complex also available where we could see ATP bound to SRPK1 and ASF also interacting with SRPK1. So this is a ternary complex, and the binding of ATP and ASF-SF2 is non-overlapping. They can bind independently to their binding sites. Then there is a known inhibitor which we used as a control for studies. SERP is called SERPINE 340, that bind exactly to the active ATP binding pocket, because it's a kinase. It must bind to ATP along with the substrate, so the phosphate group from ATP can be transferred on the substrate. So SERPINE, this inhibitor, it binds to the site where ATP binds. And if we map the binding site, and we could see that this is the site where SERPINE binds and ATP also binds the same way, and they are adjacent two sites which are involved in interaction with ASF2. So here we thought that because there are more than 300-400 molecules in a cell which are capable in binding to the ATP molecule. So if you just target the ATP binding site, the specificity may be compromised, because same compound may bind there are many kinases also, and many known kinases protein which recognize nucleotides. So all those protein, may also bind the inhibitor if you develop using only ATP binding site. So we thought that we should extend the binding of compound beyond ATP binding site. So a compound which can bind along with ATP binding site, which can inhibit binding of ASF2 also, that probably will have higher specificity. So that's why we design a grid while docking, so it can encompass area which is beyond ATP binding site. And during screening, we could get 6 compounds which were far better than the serpine control compound, the serpine 340. And out of these 6 compounds, in fact, one we call that compound 2, that was having best glide energy and also maximum number of attractive interactions with the target SRPK1. Then we compared their ADME properties. They all were fine following Lipinski's rule. Then in order to validate, we ran 100 nanosecond MD simulation, and we could see that all the trajectories were eventually stabilized, and there's no structural perturbation in binding to all these 6 compounds to SRPK1. And all these compounds, they bind to the ATP binding site. That's a common property of all the 6 compounds. That's also overlapping with serpine 340. But one compound we could see that's called compound 2, which made additional interactions. And this is the portion which recognize ASF2. So this, out of 6, one compound we could find which has better affinity, and same time which will have better selectivity also, because it does not recognize only ATP binding site, but it goes further and also bind to the site which is recognized by RNM domain of ASF2. So this also made, in fact, we compared with binding of some other known inhibitors as well, which are available in literature. And we could see that all the 6 compounds, they are better than the known inhibitors. And in fact, compound 2 is far better than rest of others also. Then we procured the 6 compounds and in order to perform in vitro studies. And we evaluated cytotoxic effect of these compounds on Jurkat cell lines. MTTSA was performed, and we could see that up to 100 micromolar concentration, there was a drastic inhibition of cell proliferation. And we could get that this compound C02 was the best. It has shown the best effect on Jurkat cell lines, T cell leukemia cell lines, with 9.51 IC50 value. So further, this compound was selected to study beyond. So we have taken this C02 compound, did FACS studies in order to see the cell cycle analysis after treatment of the cell, and we could see that by increasing concentration, the cells were accumulating into sub-G1 phase. Sub-G1 phase accumulation means cell, they are not going for division, they are stopped before division. Cell division is not occurring. Then same time, we could see expression of apoptotic genes, TNF-alpha, P53, BAX, cytochrome C, caspase-3, APF1. And we observed that up to 48 hours, there are drastic change in expression level. And cytochrome C is also reduced drastically here. So we assume that apoptosis must be occurring and may be accompanying the intrinsic pathway after treatment of compound 2. And we also observed a phosphorylation form of SRFSF2, whether phosphorylation is occurring or not. And after 18 hours and 9 hours, we could see there's drastic change. It's not abolished completely, but there's a remarkable change in expression level of presence of phosphorylated SRSF2. So that indicate that SRPK1 is the main enzyme which must be involved in phosphorylating SRSF2. And now this compound, it has 2 regions, in fact. So this is the region which binds to the ATP binding site, and this extended form, this is the one which interact with ASF-SF2 binding site. So when this compound is bound, we assume that ASF2 binding also would be inhibited along with inhibition of ATP binding. So we compare the structure of the complex, and we could see that the one key interaction with lysine 174 of SRPK1, this is SRPK1. So in case of complex formation between SRPK1 and ASF2, the one key interaction is between glutamate 170 of ASF and lysine 174 of SRPK1. And the same lysine is pulled by compound 2 here. So it is pulled towards itself. So this lysine does not remain available to bind to its substrate SF2, ASF SF2. So that's how when this compound 2 is bound, lysine 174 is engaged in the interaction, so that binding of ASF SF2 is also affected. And same time, because it's occupying ATP binding site, ATP also cannot bind. So this may be acquiring a dual mechanism to inhibit binding of both ATP and its substrate ASF2, ASF SF2 to SRPK1. And in fact, during simulation, we could see that lysine 174 is one of the common interaction which consistently remain there during entire simulation period. So that's how it also give an idea that it's a critical residue involved in interaction of stabilization of the substrate and SRPK1 complex. So we conclude here. So all the inhibitors known so far for SRPK1, they recognize and fit into the ATP binding site only. And because there are hundreds of ATP binding molecule enzyme in the cell, so that their specificity we assume would be compromised, they may bind to other targets also along with SRPK1. Whereas this compound C02, what we have got, it has shown considerable effect on cancer cell viability using T cell leukemic cell lines. And it was also found to be inhibitor of cell growth with dual mechanism. It's inhibiting binding of ATP and same time it's inhibiting binding of substrate as well. And it must be triggering intrinsic pathway of apoptosis in Jurkat cell lines. And we could see that the side chain, for example, histidine 170, tyrosine 227, lysine 174, in addition to common interaction with the ATP binding site, those can be exploited to design a better and highly specific molecule against SRPK1. So that idea is also can be inferred, can be derived from these studies. And C02 inhibit SRPK1 activity in vivo, leading to disconcerting the subcellular localization of ASF-SF2 and adversely affecting the cellular viability. That's what we have seen using in vitro studies. And this compound is more likely to provide new leads for development of much better and more specific, stronger and specific inhibitors of SRPK1, which can be further tested using in vivo studies. And I acknowledge support from CSIR, ICMR, DBT, and Gautam Buddha University, and of course from BREF. We use BREF server for performing these studies. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we can start with the questions. We are open for questions. You can ask your questions. You can put your questions in the chat box, or if you want, you can just unmute yourself. Yes, you can unmute yourself. I had
query.
changed the settings. Okay.
Audible? Sir, I have one query.
Yes.
Can we, as far as systematic concentration is concerned, for achieve the systematic concentration in the body, it is possible to change the route of drug administration? Because many times orally drug, they are affected. So can we change the route of drug administration?
Of course. That's why in emergency cases, when a quick relief is required, your drug is injected directly to your blood. When you take orally, it's not absorbed, bioavailability is reduced in comparison to when it's directly injected in your body. It is done, in fact. When quick response is desired, it's directly injected. You might have seen in hospitals also, in cases where emergency situation comes and, for example, you have extreme pain. So instead of giving painkiller to you, they directly inject in the body. So quick response is desired there to get relief.
Is there any evidence that this genetic drug or genetically modified drug uh, that when you administer it can change its performance or target of action after metabolism?
No target of action. In fact, this is evaluated much before a drug come into the market. It has to go through different stages of clinical trials.
Is it possibility to change because of the genetic modification?
Genetic modification, but how do you do genetic modification? In body is very difficult. You can do gene therapy only to a limited extent. You cannot do genetic modification in each and every cell. It's not possible. That's the limitation of gene therapy.
So we have to study the target of actions before that, and then we can check the bioavailability or active concentration at the target of action.
Definitely, everything they are evaluated much before. In fact, in preclinical development, all these studies are performed. When everything is fine, you know the bioavailability, how much drug is given, and how much is reaching eventually to the tissues. So those studies are done in clinical trials. So that's how the toxicity or what you call lethal dose or tolerant dose, those are optimized before actually a drug come into the market. So those all efficacy and safety evaluation, their mechanism is much before known. In fact, in preclinical studies, how it's binding to the receptor, how strong is the affinity, those are done before even clinical development. That's the first thing, in fact, to begin with.
Possibility to change the affinity or adverse reaction is vary from person to person.
These days, personal therapy is coming into the picture, where in fact the genome of individuals, they are sequenced and their targets are seen, how the targets are different. So at genetic level, it has not started yet, it's on paper only. But I think in future coming time will be for those gene-based, genome-based therapies. You call them individualized treatment, individualized therapies, where because every individual is different, we know that. And the drug effect also, of course, will be different. It cannot be same in everybody. You can see in practice also, you see that some drugs, they are in some individual, they are showing more effect, in other they are less effect, and that is being attributed to the genome of that individual. And that was the development of personalized medicine. So where the gene, all the genome, entire genome of individual could be sequenced, and the drugs are given according to that. So, but that's still the way further.
Yeah, because the example recent days is that the one renowned actress Angelina Jolie, her family history was breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So she done mastectomy. She removed that particular gene which can cause the particular ovarian cancer and prostate cancer.
This can be done at a developmental stage.
Yeah.
When development is occurring, then you can do. But once the body is formed, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to eradicate. For example, ovarian cancer.
Yeah.
If it is ovary is completely developed, either you have to remove it, you cannot replace every cell. It's very difficult. Even in liver regeneration capability is there. So in liver, you can do gene therapy. You can cut portion and you can transplant some. You can, from tissue culture, you can put some other segment of the liver, it will regenerate. But in all the tissues, that's not possible. And entirely 100% also is not possible. Yes, if you do at the developmental stage, when zygote is formed, there if you can play around, then it's possible.
Because she done the that particular removal of BRCA genes as a prophylactic to avoid the future breast cancer, because her mother and grandmother having the history.
Right.
So she done first the screening, genetic screening of her body, and after that she done that.
Yeah, that's what, this is a new field coming up where there is a beginning of personalized medicine. But here 100% you cannot say that until unless you do at the developmental level, or you remove the entire tissue, you remove the complete ovary and you replace it, or you design some drug which can be restricted only to the particular tissue. If it can happen, then probably I think that's possible. But I have no idea whether there is any drug available which can be restricted to particular area in the body, some specific tissue. That I don't know. Maybe if you add some specific antibodies, make some drug conjugates, that must be possible, but maybe.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello,
Hello.
Dr. Singh, sir.
Hello, Dr.
Yes, sir.
May I go?
Can I speak?
Yes, sir.
Mr.
Yes, sir.
Narendra can ask.
Okay.
So Dr.
Yeah.
Rahul, you can just wait for a second.
Yeah, okay, ma'am.
Dr. Nagendra Singh, thank you
Yes,
very
sir.
much for such a nice and wonderful presentation and very excellent work. I'm amazed to see this kind of work you are doing. I have
Thank you,
two
sir.
questions. First, regarding your BRAF facility, can you
Yes,
please mention in detail about BRAF facility URL?
BRAF, well, I need to look for it. It's there. You can Google it. BRAF is located in Pune. And
okay.
they give access to the MD simulation. These days,
Okay.
I think it's not open, but up to, I think before COVID, it was there. So you could get access. You can write to email to them. They will give you username and your password. You can access their server and you can run molecular dynamic simulation there. That's what my student did. I think it was a couple of years back.
Second is there is a concept of synthetic lethality is going on as far as personalized medicine is concerned, where two genes, if deleted or made inactive simultaneously, could lead to death of the cell or cancerous cell. And this is very much particularly in practice with regard to familial breast cancer, where BRCA1 and BRCA2s are mutated, and then PARP is being used as a target for killing the cancerous cells. So what are your with regard to your research with regard to ASF1 molecule? Is there any synthetic lethal pair available with ASF1 or
The
how we
ASF1,
can?
yeah. For ASF1, it is not available, but these days another aspect is coming up, that in genome engineering, where you can, like CRISPR-Cas you can use or other method can use, which will interrupt the given gene specifically. So in that way also, you can deal with the personalized medicine. That will coming up, of course. So far, I have no idea whether in human somebody has used this kind of studies like CRISPR-Cas to eliminate some of the genes which are responsible for a disease. But yes, that's a coming up field in genome engineering, where people must be using in future some kind of technology to edit genome directly so that expression itself would not occur for the gene responsible for a disease. So that would happen. These are new recent fields.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Dr. Rahul, you can ask your question.
Dr. Singh, sir, many thanks to you for delivering a nice talk, and you have introduced many new dimensions to participants like me. Okay,
Thank
so
you, sir.
I have one general query. Currently, we are facing the big problem of antibiotic resistance. Okay, and again that too, it is governed by the many mechanisms, right? So just would you focus on some of the progresses which are going on regarding the control of this mechanism with the help of that tools of that is drug designing tools, computer-aided drug designing tools.
Right. The one major aspect to tackle MDR is to find novel targets. In fact, that's why in microbes, in fact, we are also doing in one dimension, we are also looking for novel targets in microbes, infectious microbes. So for example, if you have a drug and it has been designed against some particular target, and for that MDR has been developed. So one simplest way could be you find other targets. If you have different targets and you design drug, at least for some time MDR will be taken care of. That's the one thing people have been doing. And that's why many new genes from different microbes, they are coming up, they are being available in databases so that they also can be explored to see how the drug development may occur against them to tackle this problem of MDR. In fact, this is a very serious way MDR is being prevailing these days, so that all our antibiotic, they have become useless after some time. So then you need to look for some new targets, or you need to look for a novel, different mechanism to inhibit growth of the microbes. But yes, this is very common way people are doing. They are exploring more targets, more proteins, which are essential for survival of the organism, so that MDR can be challenged.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions? Anyone wants to ask any more question? There was one question in the chat box. Some ligands will act like agonist and some ligands will act like antagonist. In this scenario, how can I confirm whether my ligand is agonist or antagonist for my target?
Yeah, it's simply you need to do activity assay. You look at the, biochemical in silico, you cannot, it's difficult in silico. Of course, as I told you earlier, in silico, you cannot rely alone. So you need to simply do kinetic studies. You look at the catalytic activity, how catalytic activity being changed in presence of different ligands. So from there, you can, just by looking at the alteration into kinetic parameters, one can easily infer is a agonist or antagonist in action.
Okay, sir. Anyone else? Any more question?
I think it's lunchtime. Let them have lunch.
Okay. So thank you so much, sir, for.
I want to add one point related to Dr. Rahul Bhagat. Actually, previously now we are using the antibiotic to counteract the particular bacterial function, but the latest trend also sir added the specific gene specific or nowadays mRNA technology, which can use for the counteract the action of the particular virus or bacteria. The latest Moderna mRNA vaccine, is new type of vaccine to protect against the particular infectious diseases. This is the new trigger immune response in our body.
It's gene silencing you must be talking about.
In our RNA, we can say, but that used in currently in Moderna vaccine also, mRNA. And India also, they developed the mRNA vaccine recently. I think 2-3 days back, Modi ji also declared at US summit, India developed the mRNA vaccine.
Right.
So it is a new scenario from apart from antibiotic to counteract the bacterial infection.
Yeah, because genes are specific, and microbial genes and human gene, there will not be any similarity. So you can use gene silencing in that way. That's also one way people could deal with it. That's correct.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Thank you for giving your valuable time for this FDP. And it was really informative talk as always. And I would like to invite Dr. Rashmi Singh to please extend a vote of thanks to sir.
Thank you, Roma ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. So thank you very much, sir, for this informative, interesting and interactive presentation. Your presence and your experience gave more meaning to this program. And it was very interesting to learn different aspects of protein structures and its application in drug discovery. And we all are feeling really inspired and motivated. So thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. We are lucky to have you as a resource person. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. And it was great being here. My best wishes to all of you organizers and all the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, participants. We'll join back at 2:30 for our third session. Okay, sir. Thank you so much.